On the morning of October 18, 1776, Major General William Howe put roughly 4,000 British and Hessian troops ashore at Pell's Point, New York, a quiet stretch of farmland with one job: get behind George Washington's retreating army before it reached the high ground at White Plains. Howe expected a formality. Intelligence told him the Americans were broken, starving, and running. He didn't expect a fight. He didn't think he needed to. What his men walked into instead was a regiment of fishermen, men who had never fought a land battle in their lives, using nothing but stone farm walls and a plan nobody in London would have taken seriously. So how did 750 sailors with almost no infantry training hold off a force that outnumbered them 5-1, and by Washington's entire army the exact hours it needed to survive?
To understand why this mattered, you have to understand exactly how close the American cause was to simply ending in the fall of 1776. 6 weeks earlier, Washington's army had been driven off Long Island in a defeat so total that only a night evacuation across the East River, in fog, in silence, in boats rowed by this same regiment, had kept the war from ending right there. That escape is its own story. This is what came after it. By mid-October, the Continental Army had abandoned Manhattan. New York City, the largest port in British North America, now flew the King's flag. Washington's forces were falling back through Westchester County toward a ridge at White Plains, hoping to regroup on ground they could actually defend. If Howe's army reached White Plains first, or worse, cut the roads north of it, there would be no ridge to defend. There would just be an army pinned against the Bronx River with nowhere left to run. Howe saw the opportunity immediately. Instead of pushing straight up the middle after Washington, he loaded roughly 4,000 men onto transport ships in Long Island Sound and sailed them around to Pell's Point, a spit of farmland and salt marsh that put his troops directly across Washington's line of retreat. If he landed unopposed and moved fast, he could seal the road north before the Continental Army ever reached it. Standing between Howe's 4,000 men and that road was one brigade. Roughly 750 of them belonged to a regiment that, on paper, had no business being asked to hold a defensive line against anyone. Consider what was actually at stake if that brigade failed to slow the landing. This wasn't a fight for a hill or a town. It was a fight for whether the Continental Army would continue to exist as an organized fighting force at all. Lose the road to White Plains, and Washington's men would be pinned with Long Island Sound on one side and a British army closing in from the other. No line of retreat, no high ground to fall back to, and very possibly no Continental Army left by winter. There would be no Trenton, no Princeton, no eventual French alliance, because there would be no army left standing to make that alliance worth signing. Everything that followed in this war depended, in part, on this one afternoon going a specific way. The men in that brigade were not soldiers by trade. They were fishermen, ship captains, and merchant sailors. Almost the entire regiment recruited from a single Massachusetts fishing town called Marblehead. Their commander, John Glover, wasn't a professional officer either. Before the war, he owned and captained merchant vessels out of Marblehead Harbor, a man who understood tides, currents, and rigging far better than he understood parade ground drill. When he raised his regiment in 1775, he filled it almost entirely with men from his own waterfront, fishermen who had spent their whole lives reading rough water in the dark, not marching in formation. To much of the Continental Army's more conventionally minded officer corps, that made Glover's men something close to a joke. Sailors playing at soldiering, useful maybe for hauling supplies or manning boats, but not a unit you'd trust to stand in a real fight. Some accounts even describe friction inside the army over exactly this. Units built from working sailors sat awkwardly alongside more traditionally raised regiments, and Glover's men were, at times, treated as second-tier troops, good for one specific job, moving other men across water and nothing more. That reputation had already been quietly demolished once. During the East River evacuation in late August, it was Glover's sailors, nobody else, who had the specific, practiced skill to row overloaded boats across dangerous current in total darkness, without a single one capsizing or drifting off course. It saved the Army. It also should have ended, permanently, any question of whether these men could be trusted with something that mattered. And yet 6 weeks later, at Pell's Point, they weren't being asked to row a boat. They were being asked to stand and fight, on land, with muskets, against professional British and Hessian regulars who trained for infantry combat as a full-time profession. That was a completely different kind of test, and there was no obvious reason to expect these particular men would pass it. What made Marblehead's fishing fleet different from an ordinary coastal town wasn't just that the men could handle a boat. It was the specific, brutal conditions they'd handled boats in. Marblehead crews worked the Grand Banks fishery off Newfoundland, weeks at sea in the North Atlantic, in fog, in gales, hauling in cod by hand in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he went overboard. It was a trade that killed its share of practitioners every single year, storm season after storm season, long before any of them ever picked up a musket dot. The discipline that trade demanded, staying calm when conditions turned violent, reading a situation instantly instead of waiting for orders, trusting the men on either side of you completely because your life depended on it, was, it turned out, exactly the discipline that held a fighting retreat together when the alternative was panic. Here's what Glover understood that the men landing against him did not. His troops would lose any fight fought the conventional way, standing shoulder to shoulder in open lines, trading volleys with disciplined regulars who trained for exactly that all year round. But this specific stretch of farmland at Pell's Point wasn't open ground. It was cut again and again by exactly the kind of low stone walls New England farmers had been stacking for 100 years. Glover understood something that traditional battlefield doctrine of the era largely dismissed. A numerically overwhelming force loses almost all of its advantage the moment you break the fight into a sequence of short, close-range engagements from cover, then disappear before it can bring that advantage to bear. He didn't need to win the battle, he needed to make every yard of ground expensive, then vanish, then make the next yard expensive too, over and over for as long as it took. It was, in a strange way, the same instinct that had gotten his men across the East River. A sailor doesn't try to fight the current head-on. He reads it, uses it, and moves with it toward where he actually needs to be. Glover applied exactly that instinct to a battlefield instead of a river. Glover set his brigade up in a staggered series of defensive positions, running back from the shoreline where the British were landing, using the property lines of local farms as his fortifications. The forwardmost position was manned by a smaller advance party. Some accounts put it at around 40 men, hidden behind the first stone wall closest to the beach, tasked with doing nothing but drawing the British column into range and firing the opening volley at close distance, then falling back immediately before they could be overrun. Behind that first wall sat a second regiment in a stronger position, ready to receive the British as they pushed forward past the first ambush point, expecting the resistance to be finished. Behind that, further back still, sat the main body of Glover's brigade, including his own Marbleheaders, dug in along a third stone wall that ran roughly parallel to the road the British needed to control. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Each line would fire disciplined volleys at close range, often estimated at under 100 yards, sometimes far closer, inflicting maximum casualties in the first seconds of contact, then withdraw in order to the next wall before the British could organize a flanking maneuver or bring artillery to bear. British column, expecting one skirmish and then open road, instead found itself fighting the same ambush 3 separate times over several hours, never able to tell how many more walls stood between them and the men they were chasing. Glover positioned scouts and skirmishers to slow the British approach even before contact, buying his main lines time to set. Communication between positions relied on runners and pre-arranged signals, rather than any sophisticated coordination. This was not a professionally drilled maneuver, so much as a plan built by men who understood, instinctively, how to stage a fighting retreat the way they'd stage moving cargo off an overloaded boat. one careful load at a time, never all at once, never caught in the open dot. The choice of terrain mattered as much as the plan itself. Glover had walked this ground himself before the British ever landed, and he built his defense around what the land already offered, rather than trying to impose a textbook formation onto it. The stone walls running between Pell's Point and the mainland weren't fortifications anyone had built for war. They were ordinary property boundaries, stacked by generations of New England farmers clearing rocky fields for pasture. Waist-high, unmortared, solid enough to stop a musket ball, and low enough to fire over. Glover essentially requisitioned the entire agricultural landscape of the area as a chain of prepared positions, at no cost and with no construction time, simply by choosing where to stand. Timing governed everything. Each forward position held its fire until the British column had closed to devastating range. Not the standard doctrine of opening at maximum distance to intimidate, but the opposite, waiting, letting the column believe the road ahead was clear, and only then delivering a volley meant to inflict casualties rather than simply announce a presence. The moment that volley landed, before the British could return fire in kind or maneuver around the flank, the company holding that position was already falling back toward the next wall. Discipline that depended entirely on trusting the men behind you to be ready to receive the enemy in your place. The same trust that held a fishing crew together in a gale. On the other side of those stone walls was an army that had every reason to expect an easy morning. British and Hessian forces under Howe's command had spent the previous 2 months handing the Continental Army one defeat after another. Long Island, Kips Bay, the fall of New York City itself. Officers in Howe's army had, by this point, largely stopped viewing Washington's forces as a serious military threat at all. Contemporary accounts and later historians alike describe a British command culture in the fall of 1776 that had shifted from caution to something closer to contempt. An army assumed to be a fleeing, disorganized rabble, worth chasing down rather than fighting. Howe himself carried a reputation, even among his own officers, for moving deliberately and comfortably rather than urgently. A commander in no particular hurry to finish a war he seemed to already consider as good as won. That mindset was exactly what made the Pell's Point landing so vulnerable to what was waiting for it. An army expecting to walk through open farmland toward an easy flanking maneuver, not expecting that farmland to be fortified, in effect, by nothing more than the walls that had always been there. The British and Hessian column advanced up the road from the beach in good order, expecting nothing more than a straightforward march to cut off the American retreat. Then the first wall opened fire. At close range, inside 100 yards, in places closer still, the leading British companies took a volley they never saw coming from men they had been told, implicitly, weren't real soldiers. And went down in the road. The column stalled, deployed to return fire and flank the position, and by the time they'd fought their way to that first wall, the fishermen behind it were already gone, falling back in order to the next line. The British pushed forward again, reorganized, advanced, and hit the second wall. Another volley at close range, another stall, another retreat in good order before the British numbers could close the distance and turn a firefight into a rout. This repeated a third time at the main line, Glover's own Marbleheaders holding as the British and Hessian troops, increasingly cautious now, advanced more slowly than before, no longer treating this as a formality. Each exchange cost the British time and men. Each retreat cost Glover almost nothing, because his men were never trying to hold ground permanently, only long enough to make the next 100 yards expensive, then disappear again before the numerical advantage across from them could be brought fully to bear. By the third position, the rhythm of the fight had settled into something almost mechanical. The crack of massed muskets at close range, a pause thick with smoke and shouting as officers on both sides tried to reorganize, then the sound of an entire company disengaging over open ground toward the next wall before the British could close the distance. Hessian troops advancing alongside the British column, unfamiliar with this specific style of fighting, found themselves walking into the same trap their allies had just been caught in, a wall that looked empty until it wasn't. What should have been a single afternoon's march had become, wall by wall,
one of the most frustrating days British and Hessian officers had experienced since landing in America. By the time the fighting at Pell's Point wound down that afternoon, Howe's column had spent most of a day advancing perhaps a mile against a force outnumbered roughly 5 to 1, a mile it had expected to cover, unopposed, before breakfast. Here's where the numbers get almost hard to believe. Glover's brigade, fighting the entire engagement from prepared positions and choosing every moment of contact, suffered casualties that several sources describe as remarkably light, commonly cited in the range of single digits to a few dozen men killed or wounded. British and Hessian losses, by contrast, are reported in some accounts as several times higher. Historians still go back and forth on the exact figures, and the disparity is large enough that it's worth treating with real caution rather than repeating a single number as settled fact. What isn't disputed is the outcome that mattered most. The delay held. Howe's column did not reach the road in time to cut off Washington's retreat. The Continental Army completed its withdrawal to White Plains, bruised, exhausted, but intact, and still an army. The consequences of that single afternoon rippled forward for the rest of the war. An army that survives to fight another day is an army that can still win a war. And just over 2 months later, on Christmas night, it was these same Marblehead sailors, hours from the expiration of their enlistments, who rowed Washington's troops across an ice-choked Delaware River for the surprise attack on Trenton, the Continental Army's first real offensive victory of the war. Henry Knox, the former Boston bookseller turned chief of artillery, who crossed that night and who famously kept 2 fingers permanently disfigured from a hunting accident years earlier, would later call the crossing one of the most difficult operations he'd ever witnessed. Thomas Paine, marching with the retreating army that same terrible autumn, wrote the words that would open his pamphlet, The American Crisis, describing exactly the kind of army Glover's regiment had just spent a day keeping alive. Within days of that Delaware crossing, most of Glover's regiment's enlistments simply expired. The men who had arguably done more than almost any other single unit to keep the Continental Army alive through its worst season went home to Marblehead to go back to fishing. There was no ceremony for it. The regiment that ambushed an empire with stone walls and boat-handling instincts just quietly stopped existing as a unit, its job finished. It's a pattern worth remembering whenever a much larger force meets a much smaller one. Overwhelming strength only wins if it's allowed to fight on its own terms. Take away the open ground. Force the fight into a series of short, controlled exchanges on unfamiliar terms, and the bigger force's confidence becomes the very thing that slows it down. It's the same underlying principle behind the little ships of Dunkirk more than a century and a half later. Civilian boat handlers, not naval professionals, pulling off an operation the conventional military couldn't manage alone, because the skill that mattered most wasn't the one anyone expected to matter. Today, the ground at Pell's Point sits inside Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, New York. Mostly quiet parkland, the stone walls long gone or buried, joggers and dog walkers passing over ground where 750 fishermen once made an empire's army pay for every yard of a retreat that was never supposed to be a fight at all. There's a statue of John Glover today on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, cast in bronze, permanently still, commemorating a man who spent most of his life reading water, not fighting wars. No monument marks the exact spot where the first volley came over that first stone wall. Most people who pass through the park today have no idea it was ever there at all.